Lieutenant Celera Moonwhisper walked through the dark halls of the space station, and her boots made soft sounds on the metal floor. And she was not alone because her small dragon Ember sat on her shoulder, and the dragon was the size of a cat, but everyone knew dragons were dangerous no matter how small they looked. The space station was old and dirty, and the lights flickered sometimes and made strange shadows on the walls, and Celera did not like this place, but her job brought her here, and she had been chasing Jake Miller for 3 months across 7 different star systems, and now he was finally here at Outpost Theta 9. She touched her badge, which was made of crystal, and it glowed with a soft blue light, and the badge showed she was a police officer for the Galactic Enforcement Division, and she had trained for many years to get this job, and she was good at catching criminals, but humans were still new to space, and they were hard to understand. Ember made a small sound, and puffed out a tiny bit of fire that bent the air around them. And Celera knew her dragon friend was ready for anything, and they had been partners for 5 years, and Ember could sense danger before it happened. And right now, the dragon was alert, but calm. The cantina was at the end of the hall, and Celera could hear music and voices coming from inside, and she stopped at the door and looked through the small window. And there he was, sitting at the bar with a glass of brown liquid that was probably fake bourbon because real Earth alcohol was too expensive out here. Jake Miller was big even sitting down, and his shoulders were wide, and his hands had scars, and his brown hair needed a cut, and he wore simple clothes that helped him blend in. But Celera knew who he was because she had studied his file for weeks and memorized his face. She pushed open the door and walked in, and the cantina was full of different aliens, and some looked at her and then looked away because they knew she was a cop, and cops meant trouble. And she walked straight to the bar and stood behind Miller and waited. He turned around slowly like he had been expecting her, and he smiled, and his smile was tired but real, and he raised his glass to her and said, "Officer Moonwhisper," in a calm voice. And then he said, "It took you long enough to find me." Celera was surprised he knew her name, but she did not show it, and she kept her face neutral and professional, and she said, "Jake Miller, you are under arrest for smuggling restricted technology and breaking sections 7 through 15 of the Prohibited Technology Act, and you have the right to remain silent." Miller laughed, but it was not a happy sound, and he finished his drink in one gulp, and put the glass down carefully and stood up, and he was taller than her by a lot, and she had to look up at him, but she was not scared, because she had Ember, and her training and her weapon. He held out his hands and said, "No need for violence, officer. We'll come quietly, and I know when I am caught, and besides I am tired of running, and maybe it is time for this to end." The containment cuffs appeared around his wrists with a flash of blue light, and they would stop him from running or fighting, and Celera was confused because this was too easy, and criminals usually fought or tried to escape. But Miller just stood there calm and patient. Ember flew off her shoulder and circled around Miller, and the dragon was checking him for weapons or tricks, and found nothing and landed back on Celera, and made a worried sound because something felt wrong about this whole situation. Other people in the cantina were watching now, and some whispered to each other, and Celera wanted to leave quickly before trouble started, and she said, "Come with me to my ship and we will process you there, and then take you to the capital station for trial." Miller nodded and walked with her and did not resist. And as they left the cantina, he said, "You should check your communicator, officer, because I think you will find an interesting message waiting for you, and it might change everything." Celera ignored him because criminals always tried to trick you with words, and she led him through the station and back to her patrol ship, which was parked in Docking Bay 7, and the ship was silver and sleek, and had the symbol of the Galactic Enforcement Division painted on the side. She opened the rear hatch and guided Miller inside to the holding cell, which was a small room with energy barriers instead of bars, and once he was inside, she activated the barriers and they hummed with power and glowed pale blue. Miller sat on the bench in the cell and looked comfortable, like he was in a hotel room instead of jail. And he said seriously, "Officer, check your messages because time is important and things are happening that you need to know about." Ember flew around the ship, checking everything like she always did, and the dragon was nervous and kept returning to look at Miller and then flying away again, and Celera had never seen her partner act this way before. She went to the bridge of her ship and sat in the pilot chair and started the launch sequence, but her communicator kept blinking with a priority. message, and finally she opened it and read it, and her purple eyes went wide with shock. The message was from the High Council itself, and it had the highest security codes, and it said that all charges against Jake Miller were dropped immediately, and he was to be released, and it also gave her access to classified files she had never seen before. Her hands shook as she opened the files and looked at the pictures and documents inside, and there were images of sick children on frontier planets, and families crying and begging for medicine and death certificates with numbers that made her feel sick. She stood up fast and walked back to the holding cell and stared at Miller through the energy barrier, and her voice was angry when she said, "What is this, and what have you done, and why are they letting you go?" Miller looked at her with sad eyes and said, "The medicine I was smuggling saves lives, officer, and the government has been hiding it and selling it for huge profits while people die, and someone high up was getting rich from suffering, and now that I got caught, they had to admit the truth." Scilara felt like the floor was moving under her feet, and everything she believed about law and justice was breaking apart, and she had spent 15 years catching criminals and believing she was helping people, but what if she had been helping the wrong side? Ember landed on her shoulder and pressed against her neck, and the dragon was trying to comfort her, but Scilara barely noticed, because her mind was spinning with this new information, and she did not know what to think or feel. Miller stood up and came close to the barrier, and his voice was gentle when he said, "I know this is hard to accept, but the files are real, and you can check them yourself, and I was a doctor before all this, and I took an oath to help people, and that is all I have been trying to do." She looked at the files again and cross-referenced them with her databases, and everything checked out, and the medicine he had been smuggling was just antibiotics and vaccines that cost almost nothing to make but were being sold for fortunes to desperate colonies. "The council wants me to let you go," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "And they are calling you a hero now and saying you helped expose corruption. But you were still breaking the law." "Sometimes the law is wrong," Miller said, "and sometimes good people have to break bad laws to save lives. And I knew I might get caught. But those kids needed medicine, and I could not just watch them die when I could help." Scilara turned away because she could not look at him anymore, and she felt tears in her eyes, which made her angry because she never cried, and she was supposed to be strong and sure and know right from wrong. But now everything was confused. She deactivated the energy barrier and it fizzled out, and Miller stepped out of the cell, but he did not try to leave, and instead he said, "There is more to tell you, if you want to hear it, and things are about to get much worse." "What do you mean?" she asked, and turned back to face him and saw that his expression was serious and worried, and not like someone who had just been freed, but like someone who knew danger was coming. "There is going to be a war," he said, "and the Outer Rim Coalition found out about the medicine conspiracy, and they are angry and ready to fight, and the government is trying to cover it up. But it might be too late to stop what is coming, and many people will die." Scilara felt cold despite the warm air in her ship, and she realized that catching Miller had triggered something bigger than she understood, and she was just a small part of a huge machine that was breaking apart, and she did not know what to do next. Scilara sat in her pilot chair and stared at the screens full of data that Miller had shown her, and each document made her feel worse, and there were shipping logs that showed medicine being held back while prices went up, and there were communications between senators discussing profit margins while people died. Miller stood behind her and did not speak, and let her process everything at her own speed, and Ember perched on the console and watched them both with bright, intelligent eyes, and sometimes the dragon would make soft chirping sounds of comfort. The worst part was the videos, and they showed real people on real planets begging for help, and children too weak to stand, and doctors with empty medicine cabinets and parents selling everything they owned to buy simple antibiotics that should cost almost nothing. She found one report about a Centauri colony where 200 children died from a disease that could be cured with basic human medicine, and the local government had requested help, but was told the medicine was restricted and dangerous, and they all died within a month. Her stomach hurt, and she wanted to throw up, but she forced herself to keep reading. And there was a pattern in the data, and certain names kept appearing. And Senator Kaylee Ashworth was at the center of everything, and she had signed most of the restriction orders. "This has been happening for 20 years, Scilara said, and her voice was quiet and shocked. "And how did no one notice or stop it, and where were the other officers and investigators?" And why did it take a smuggler to reveal the truth? Miller sat down in the co-pilot chair, and his face was tired and sad, and he said, "People did notice, but they were silenced or transferred or had accidents. And the corruption goes very deep and includes judges and police commanders and even some members of the High Council." She turned to look at him and really saw him for the first time, and not as a criminal, but as a person who had risked everything to help others, and his brown eyes were kind despite all the hardness life had given him, and she wondered how many others like him she had arrested. "Tell me your story," she said, "and I want to understand how a doctor becomes a smuggler, and why you chose this path when you could have had a comfortable life following the rules." Miller leaned back and was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding where to start, and then he began talking, and his voice was steady, but she could hear old pain underneath. The words, he said, "I came to space 10 years ago full of hope and excitement, and Earth had just joined the galactic community, and we were told we could help make the galaxy better and share our knowledge and learn from other species. I was assigned to a medical station on the frontier, and it was hard work but rewarding, and I was saving lives and making a difference. And then I noticed something strange happening with our supply requests. We would ask for basic medicines and be told they were restricted or dangerous for non-humans, and I knew this was wrong because I had studied alien biology, and our antibiotics were safe for most species. Then the first child died in my ward, and her name was Luna, and she was only 6 years old and had what you humans call strep throat, and I had to watch her die knowing that simple penicillin would save her. I tried to go through proper channels and filed reports and contacted supervisors and even wrote to senators, but nothing changed and more. Children died, and I could not sleep at night knowing I could save them if I just had the medicine." Miller stopped talking and rubbed his face with both hands, and Solara could see this still hurt him even after all these years, and Ember flew over and landed on his shoulder and nuzzled his cheek, which surprised everyone. He smiled at the little dragon and continued his story and said, "One day, I made a choice and I stole a case of antibiotics from the restricted warehouse and gave it to the families who needed it and saved 12 lives that week. Of course, I got caught and lost my medical license and was going to be arrested, but I escaped and decided if they would not let me be a legal doctor, then I would be an illegal one, and started smuggling medicine to whoever needed it. For 5 years, I ran medicine to frontier colonies and built a network of people who believed in what I was doing, and we saved thousands of lives, but we were always running and hiding and losing friends to prison or worse." Solara listened and felt something breaking inside her chest, and it was her faith in the system she had served her whole adult life. And she thought about all the criminals she had caught, and wondered how many were actually heroes. "Why did you let me catch you?" she asked. "And you could have kept running, but you sat in that bar waiting for me like you wanted to be arrested." Miller smiled, but it was sad, and he said, "Because I am tired of running, and because sometimes you need to get caught to expose the truth, and I knew they would have to drop the charges once I was in custody, and too many people would be watching. Also, I researched you, Officer Moonwhisper, and you have a perfect record and always follow the rules, but you also care about justice, and I hoped you would listen and understand and maybe even help." She stood up fast and paced around the small bridge, and her mind was racing with thoughts and questions and anger at being used, but also respect for his cleverness and sacrifice. Ember flew between them, chirping and making small smoke rings, and the dragon seemed to be trying to say something important, and Solara finally paid attention and realized her partner was indicating the navigation console. The proximity alert was blinking, and 3 ships were approaching fast, and they were not patrol ships but military vessels, and their weapons were powered up and targeting locks were activating. Miller jumped up and looked at the screen, and his face went pale, and he said, "Those are coalition ships, and this is happening faster than I thought, and we need to leave right now." Solara sat back in the pilot chair and started the launch sequence, but the military ships were already sending warnings and ordering her to surrender and prepare to be boarded, and she ignored them and fired up the engines. "Why are they after us?" she asked while flying through evasive patterns. "And we are on the same side now, and they should know you are free and the truth is coming out." "They do not know I am here," Miller said, and grabbed onto something as the ship shook from a near miss. "And they probably think you are transferring me to prison and want to rescue me or capture me to get my information." The patrol ship was fast, but not built for combat, and the military vessels were gaining, and Solara had to use all her skill to avoid their weapons, and Ember was helping by using her unique ability to see slightly into the future, and chirp warnings. A plasma bolt hit their shields and the ship shuddered and alarms started screaming, and Solara knew they could not take many more hits and she needed a plan fast. "There is an asteroid field nearby," she said, "and we can lose them in there, but it is dangerous, and many ships have been lost in those rocks." "Do it," Miller said. "And I trust you, and besides, we do not have much choice, and those ships will not stop until they have us." She turned hard toward the asteroid field and pushed the engines to maximum, and the ship groaned with the strain but held together, and behind them the military ships followed and kept firing. The asteroids appeared on the screen like a wall of death, and they were moving and spinning and crashing into each other, and Solara had never flown through anything this dangerous, but she had no choice. She entered the field at full speed and immediately had to dodge a rock the size of a building, and then another and another, and her hands moved without conscious thought. And years of training took over. Miller was gripping his seat and his face was white, but he did not scream or complain, and just trusted her to keep them alive. And Ember was pressed against Solara's neck and purring, which helped her stay calm. One of the military ships tried to follow and clipped an asteroid and exploded in a ball of fire, and the other two slowed down and stayed at the edge of the field and waited for them to come out or die. For 20 minutes, Solara flew through the deadly maze, and several times they came within meters of destruction, but she kept them moving and alive, and finally they emerged on the other side, battered but whole. The military ships were gone and either gave up or went around the long way, and Solara set course for deep space and engaged the autopilot, and then slumped in her chair and realized she was shaking. Miller put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Thank you. And that was amazing flying. And I have never seen anyone handle a ship like that. And you saved both our lives." She looked at him and laughed, but it sounded a little crazy, and said, "I just helped a criminal escape from military ships and flew through an asteroid field. And my career is over, and I do not even know what I am doing anymore." "You are doing the right thing," he said, and his voice was certain, and sometimes that means breaking rules and taking risks. But saving lives is always worth it. And you will see. Ember made a sound of agreement and breathed a perfect smoke ring that hung in the air like a promise, and Solara realized she had already chosen her path when she read those files and saw those dying children, and there was no going back now. The ship drifted in deep space far from any star systems, and Solara had turned off all tracking devices and communications except for encrypted channels, and she knew they were being hunted. But for now they were safe and hidden in the vast darkness. Miller was working at the communication console and talking to people in code and making plans and arrangements, and Solara listened and learned that his network was much bigger than she had imagined, and included doctors and pilots and even some government officials. She was reading more files and learning the full scope of the conspiracy, and it was not just medicine but also food production technology and water purification systems, and anything that could help struggling colonies was restricted and sold at impossible prices. Ember had made a nest in the corner using some spare blankets and was sleeping. But even in sleep, the little dragon glowed softly and occasionally puffed small clouds of quantum smoke that dissipated into nothing. Message came through on the encrypted channel, and Miller read it, and his face became very serious. And he turned to Solara and said, "We have a problem, and the coalition is moving faster than expected, and they plan to attack in 3 days. Attack?" What, she asked, although she feared she already knew the answer, and her stomach felt cold and heavy like she had swallowed ice. "The peace celebration at the Capitol Station," he said, "and every important senator and council member will be there, and thousands of civilians, and the coalition wants to expose the truth, but some factions want revenge and blood." Solara stood up so fast her chair spun, and she said, "They cannot do that, and innocent people will die and children will be orphaned, and this will start a real war that could destroy everything." Miller nodded and looked tired and older than his years and said, "I know, and that is why I need to go there and try to stop it, or at least minimize the damage. And I have friends in the coalition who think like me, but they are outnumbered." "You mean we need to go there?" she said, and surprised herself with the words but knew they were true. "And I am not letting you face this alone, and besides, I know the station and its security better than you." He smiled, and it was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face and made him look younger and hopeful. And he said, "Thank you, and I was hoping you would say that, but I did not want to ask." They spent the next hours planning and studying the station layout, and identifying the most likely targets and ways to prevent mass casualties. And Ember woke up and helped by projecting small holographic maps with her quantum fire ability. The Coalition had people inside the station already, and they were planning to hack the security systems and steal data from the black site servers that contained all the evidence of corruption, and then broadcast it to the entire galaxy. That part was good and necessary, but some Coalition members wanted to blow up the government wing during the ceremony and kill everyone responsible for the medicine conspiracy, and they did not care about collateral damage. Miller had been trying to convince them to stick to the data theft. But extremists were gaining influence and pointing to all their dead children and ruined colonies and saying justice required blood for blood. I was a Dr. Salara and I swore to do no harm. Miller said, and his voice was full of pain, and I cannot let them turn me into a weapon of revenge, and we have to find another way. She thought about her 15 years of service and all the ceremonies she had attended and the people she knew who would be there, and some were good people who did not know about the conspiracy, and they did not deserve to die. But she also thought about Luna and all the other children who died needlessly, and the families destroyed by greed, and she understood why some Coalition members wanted violent revenge, even if she could not support it. We need to be there before the attack, she said, and we need to find a way to get the data out but prevent the bombing and save lives on both sides, and it will not be easy. Miller was already working on false identities for them, and his network was efficient and professional, and within hours they had new names and backgrounds and clearance codes that would get them into the station. Salara would be Lieutenant Amy Chen from the Diplomatic Security Division, and Miller would be Dr. Carl Brooks, a medical advisor for the Human Embassy, and their cover story was they were checking security arrangements for the human delegation. Ember was more difficult because security dragons were rare and memorable, but they decided she would pretend to be a pet of a visiting dignitary, and they got her a decorative collar with fake ownership papers. The journey to the capital station took 2 days, and they spent the time preparing and rehearsing their cover stories and studying, building plans and identifying Coalition contacts who might help them. Miller taught her some basic medical knowledge in case she needed to maintain her cover, and she taught him security protocols and procedures, and how to act like someone who belonged in government buildings. They also talked about their lives and dreams and fears, and Salara learned that Miller had a sister on Earth who thought he was dead, and he learned that she had joined the police because her parents were killed by pirates when she was young. Ember spent most of the time practicing being a pampered pet instead of a trained security dragon, and she was surprisingly good at acting spoiled and demanding, and even learned to beg for treats as they approached the capital station. Salara felt her heart rate increase, and this was where her career had started, and where she had received commendations and made friends, and now she was returning as a traitor and spy. The station was huge and looked like a crystal flower floating in space, and its transparent walls showed the lights of thousands of offices and apartments and shops, and it was beautiful and terrible at the same time. They docked without incident, and their false papers passed inspection, and Salara was relieved but also worried, because if it was this easy for them, then Coalition terrorists could also get in. The peace celebration was tomorrow, and they had less than 20 hours to find the Coalition operatives and convince them to abandon the bombing or find a way to stop them and save thousands of innocent lives. Miller squeezed her hand as they walked into the station and said, "We can do this, and we have to believe that truth and justice can win without violence, and that people can change and choose better paths." She squeezed back and tried to share his optimism, but she had been a cop too long and knew how rare happy endings were, and how often good intentions led to disaster and death. Ember rode on her shoulder and played her part perfectly, and several people stopped to admire the beautiful dragon and ask about her breed and origin, and Salara made up stories and smiled and felt like a fraud. They checked into a hotel near the government district and began making contact with Miller Network, and the news was not good because the extremists had taken control, and the bombing was definitely happening. One contact. A young engineer named Lisa told them where the bombs were being placed, and it was worse than they thought because there were 12 devices scattered throughout the government wing and they were all connected. If we try to disable one, they all go off, Lisa said, and her voice shook with fear, and I helped design the trigger system before. I knew what it was for, and now I cannot stop it, and people are going to die because of me. Miller comforted her and said it was not her fault, and they were all being used and manipulated, but they would find a way to stop this and save lives and make things right. Scilara was thinking hard and using her knowledge of security systems and procedures, and there had to be a weakness somewhere, and every system had flaws and every plan had holes. Then she remembered something, and her eyes went wide, and she said, "The quantum dampening field in every government building has one to prevent teleportation and phasing, and if we can overload it, the electromagnetic pulse will disable all electronics, including the bombs," Miller said, and caught on. "Immediately, but also every life support system and medical device and security barrier. And it will cause chaos but not mass death." Ember chirped and projected a small hologram showing the location of the dampening field generator, and it was in the sub-basement and heavily guarded but accessible through maintenance tunnels. They had a plan, but it was dangerous and required precise timing, and they would need to overload the generator right before the bombs were set to explode, and then help evacuate people in the confusion. Lisa agreed to help and said she could guide them through the tunnels and override security doors, and she wanted to make up for her part in creating the trigger system. Even if it meant risking her life, they spent the rest of the night gathering supplies and studying the route and making backup plans and trying not to think about everything that could go wrong, and how many people depended on them succeeding. As dawn broke through the station artificial day-night cycle, Scilara put on her dress uniform for what might be the last time, and looked at herself in the mirror and wondered if she would survive the day. Miller stood beside her in his formal clothes, and they looked like a proper diplomatic couple, and no one would suspect they were planning to sabotage a government installation and stop a terrorist attack. Ember polished her scales until they shone and practiced looking decorative and harmless, and only Scilara could see the determination in the little dragon eyes and the readiness for battle. "Today we save lives," Miller said, "and no matter what happens, we try to do the right thing and protect." The government district was crowded with beings from across the galaxy, and everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, and the atmosphere was festive and happy, and no one suspected that death was hiding in the walls and floors around them. Scilara walked through the security checkpoints, and her false identity held up perfectly, and the guards smiled and waved her through, and she felt sick lying to fellow officers who were just doing their jobs and trying to keep people safe. Miller stayed close beside her and played his role as a medical advisor, and he answered questions about human biological compatibility with confident technical words, and no one doubted he belonged there. Ember performed beautifully and charmed everyone who saw. Her and several high-ranking officials asked where they could acquire such a magnificent pet dragon, and Scilara gave them false contact information with a smile. They met Lisa at a maintenance access point, and she was pale and scared, but determined, and she had mapped out the route to the dampening field generator and calculated exactly how much power they needed to create the pulse. The maintenance tunnels were narrow and hot, and smelled of ozone and recycled air, and they had to crawl in some sections, and Scilara ruined her dress uniform, but that did not matter anymore. As they moved deeper into the station, Lisa whispered updates about the coalition plan, and the bombs would trigger in 6 hours during the height of the celebration, when the most people would be gathered together. "We are cutting it close," Miller said as they paused at an intersection, "and we need at least an hour to overload the generator properly and then get clear before the pulse hits and help with evacuation." Scilara was studying her security scanner and tracking guard movements, and there were 2 checkpoints ahead that they needed to pass, and her clearance would not work down here, where only maintenance staff were allowed. Ember flew ahead to scout and came back chirping warnings, and there were 4 guards at the first checkpoint, and they were alert and professional and would not be fooled by false papers or smooth talking. Lisa suggested a ventilation shaft that bypassed the checkpoint, but it was too small for humans, and only Ember could fit through, and they needed another solution. Then Scilara had an idea, and it went against all her training, but desperate times required desperate measures, and she pulled out her real badge and walked straight toward the checkpoint. The guard saw her coming and straightened up, and one started to challenge her, but then saw the badge and recognized her name and rank, and his whole demeanor changed to respectful attention. "Lieutenant Moonwhisper," one guard said, "and we were not told you would be inspecting today, and is there a security concern we should know about?" She put on her command voice and said, "Routine inspection, and I am checking vulnerable points before the celebration, and you are doing Excellent work, but I need to pass through and check the deeper levels. The guards exchanged glances, but her reputation and rank carried weight, and they stepped aside and saluted, and she walked past them with Miller and Lisa following and trying to look like they belonged. Once past the checkpoint, Solara started shaking, and Miller touched her arm and said, "That was brilliant and brave, and you used their trust in you, and I am sorry you had to do that." She knew she had just burned her last bridge, and after today she could never return to her old life and never be a real officer again, and the weight of that settled on her shoulders like a mountain. The second checkpoint was automated, and Lisa was able to hack it with some device she pulled from her bag, and they moved past without incident and finally reached the sub-basement, where the generator hummed with power. The dampening field generator was huge and filled most of the room, and cables ran from it in all directions, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with energy, and touching it wrong could kill them instantly. Lisa got to work and pulled out tools and began adjusting settings and rerouting power and explaining what she was doing in technical terms that Solara did not understand, but Miller followed along and helped where he could. Ember perched on a pipe and kept watch, and her eyes reflected the electric blue glow of the generator, and she made small warning sounds whenever she sensed someone approaching. In the tunnels, it took 90 minutes to set up the overload, and Lisa had to be careful not to trigger any alarms, and several times they had to stop and hide when maintenance workers passed by. But finally, everything was ready. "The generator will overload in exactly 4 hours, Lisa said, and wiped sweat from her face, and that gives us 30 minutes before the bombs are set to trigger, and the pulse should disable them and everything else electronic. We need to get to the celebration," Miller said, "and start evacuating people without causing panic, and make sure emergency exits are clear, and medical teams are standing by, and this is going to be chaos." Solara was thinking about all the innocent people who would be affected, and the pulse would disable elevators and life support and medical equipment, and some beings might die from the disruption, even if the bombs did not explode. She made a decision and pulled out her communicator and started typing a message to station security and warning them about a possible attack and telling them to quietly prepare evacuation routes and emergency procedures. Miller looked at her with surprise and said, "They will trace that message and know you are involved, and you are sacrificing everything to warn them." "I became a police officer to protect people," she said, "and that does not change just because I am on the wrong side of the law now. And if even one person survives because of this warning, then it is worth it." They made their way back through the tunnels and emerged into a storage room near the main celebration hall, and they could hear music and laughter and hundreds of voices enjoying the party. Solara straightened her ruined uniform and tried to look presentable, and they entered the celebration and split up to cover more ground and look for coalition operatives who might try to trigger the bombs manually. The hall was magnificent and decorated with flowers from 100 worlds and floating lights that danced in patterns, and important people from across the galaxy mingled and discussed politics and trade. She recognized many faces, and some were corrupt senators who deserved punishment, but others were good people trying to make the galaxy better, and there were also staff members and servers and musicians who were just doing their jobs. Miller was moving through the crowd and using his charm and medical knowledge to strike up conversations and subtly guide people toward exits and suggest they might want to see the beautiful view from the observation deck. Ember had abandoned her pet act and was flying around the ceiling and using her quantum abilities to scan for hidden weapons or explosives, and several security guards noticed, but were too confused to react. Then Solara spotted Senator Ashworth near the main stage, and the woman was laughing and accepting congratulations for something, and she looked so normal and pleasant and not like someone who had caused thousands of deaths. Rage filled Solara's chest, and she wanted to march over and arrest the senator and drag her away in chains and make her answer for all those dead children. But that would not help anyone right now. A hand touched her shoulder, and she spun around and found herself face to face with Commander Torres, who had been her mentor and friend, and his face showed confusion and concern. "Solara, what are you doing here?" Torres asked. "And you were supposed to be transporting a prisoner. And why do you look like you crawled through a sewer, and what is going on?" She opened her mouth and closed it and could not find words, and how could she explain that she was now a criminal, trying to stop a terrorist attack, and that everything they had worked for was built on lies? Before she could answer, alarms started blaring, and her warning had been received, and security was beginning evacuation procedures. and asking everyone to calmly move to the exits. Torres grabbed her arm and demanded answers, but she pulled, free, and ran toward the main power controls, and there were still 2 hours before the generator overload, and something was wrong. Miller appeared at her side and said the coalition moved up their timeline, and someone is trying to trigger the bombs manually, and we need to find them now or everyone dies. They ran through the panicking crowd and searched for anyone acting suspicious, and Ember dive-bombed a man who was reaching for something in his jacket and knocked him unconscious. More security arrived and started arresting coalition operatives, but there were too many and some were fighting back, and energy bolts started flying and turning the celebration into a battleground. Scilara tackled a woman who was typing on a detonator, and they fought and rolled across the floor, and the woman was strong and desperate. But Scilara training won, and she knocked her opponent out. The main lights flickered and went out, and emergency lighting activated and casting everything in red shadows, and people screamed and pushed toward exits and trampled each other in fear. Miller was helping injured people and dragging them to safety and using his medical skills to save lives. And he had forgotten about catching terrorists and returned to his true calling of healing. Then Scilara saw him and recognized the man from Coalition intelligence photos, and he was the leader of the extremist faction, and he had a manual detonator and was pushing through the crowd toward the government wing. She chased after him and pushed through the mob, and her uniform was torn and bloodied, but she did not stop, and she could not let him reach those bombs and kill thousands. The chaos after the failed bombing gave them cover to escape, and Miller leaned on Scilara as they made their way through service corridors, and Ember flew ahead to scout for danger, and they moved like ghosts through the confusion. Security was everywhere, but focused on helping victims and catching known terrorists and not looking for an injured human doctor and a elf police officer with a small dragon. And they reached the docking bay without major incident. Lisa met them at Miller's ship with tears streaming down her face, and she said the data theft worked and everything is uploading to every news network in the galaxy, and they cannot stop it now. And the truth is, free. They boarded the ship, and Scilara took the pilot seat, and her hands moved automatically through launch procedures while her mind tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. As they cleared the station, Miller activated the communication system and started the broadcast that would change everything, and his voice was calm and steady despite his injuries. "Citizens of the galaxy," he said, "and my name is Dr. Jake Miller, and I was labeled a criminal for smuggling medicine to dying children, and today, you will learn why that medicine was restricted and who profited from suffering." The files began transmitting and showed everything from the original restriction orders to the bank accounts of corrupt senators and the death tolls from preventable diseases, and the conspiracy laid bare for all to see. Scilara flew them toward the outer system and listened to communication channels explode with shock and anger and disbelief, and already some planets were demanding investigations and arrests and justice. Behind them, the capital station was in chaos, but not the violent chaos the extremists had wanted, and instead it was the chaos of truth, breaking lies apart and systems crumbling under the weight of their own corruption. Senator Ashworth appeared on the news and tried to spin the story, and claimed the restrictions were for safety, and the profits were for research. But no one believed her, and crowds were gathering outside government buildings. Miller slumped in his chair and looked exhausted but satisfied, and he said, "It is done, and now the healing can begin, and not just for bodies but for the whole galaxy, and trust can be rebuilt." Scilara reached over and took his hand and squeezed gently and said, "You did it, and you saved so many lives and exposed the truth, and you are a hero, even if history might not remember it that way." He laughed weakly and said, "We did it, and all of us together, and you gave up everything to help, and that takes more courage than anything I ever did, and you are the real hero." Here Ember landed on the console between them and chirped proudly and projected a small holographic heart with her quantum fire, and both humans smiled at the little dragon display of affection. They flew for hours and jumped through hyperspace twice to throw off pursuit, and finally stopped at a remote space station that Miller Network controlled, and where they could rest and heal, and plan. The medical bay was small but well equipped, and Scilara helped treat Miller injuries properly, and the wound was not as bad as it looked, and he would recover fully with rest and care. As he lay in the medical bed, he looked at her and said, "What will you do now? And you cannot go back to being a police officer, and your old life is gone. and I am sorry for that." She sat beside him and thought about the question, and everything had changed so fast, and she had gone from hunter to hunted, and from law enforcement to lawbreaker, and her whole identity was shattered. But then she realized something important and said, "I am still a police officer, and I still protect people and serve justice, and I just learned that sometimes the law and justice are not the same thing, and I choose justice." Miller smiled and reached out to touch her face gently and said, "Then stay with me and help build something better. And the galaxy needs people who understand both sides and can bridge the gap between order and freedom." Before she could answer, alerts started sounding, and news feeds showed massive protests on dozens of worlds and governments falling, and new elections being called, and the revolution had begun. Some planets were descending into violence, and others were handling the transition peacefully, and the galaxy was reshaping itself and choosing between revenge and reconciliation, and chaos and order. Over the following days, they watched from their hidden station as events unfolded, and the High Council disbanded and reformed with new members, and trials began for those responsible for the conspiracy. Senator Ashworth was arrested and faced charges for thousands of deaths, and other corrupt officials were rounded up, and some fled to uncharted space and would probably never face justice. The coalition also faced scrutiny, and the extremists who had planned the bombing were arrested and tried, and both sides had to confront their crimes and find a path forward together. Miller's recovery was aided by many visitors and doctors and pilots and smugglers and ordinary people whose lives he had saved came to thank him and offer support, and Solara saw how many people he had helped. She started working with the network and helping coordinate medicine deliveries to planets still suffering, and using her knowledge of law enforcement to keep them safe from remaining corrupt. Officials Ember became something of a mascot, and her image appeared on protest signs and underground broadcasts, and the little dragon who helped save the peace celebration and proved that courage came in all sizes. One day a message arrived for Solara, and it was from Commander Torres, and he wrote that he was proud of her and understood her choices, and that real justice sometimes required breaking rules. He also wrote that reforms were happening, and the police force was being restructured, and they wanted people with experience and integrity to help rebuild. And would she consider returning under the new system? She showed the message to Miller, and he said, "You should go, and they need you. And you could help create the kind of law enforcement that serves justice instead of corruption and make real change. But I want to stay with you," she said. "And we make a good team. And there is still so much work to do, and medicine to deliver, and people to help. And I cannot abandon that." He pulled her close and kissed her forehead and said, "Who says you have to choose, and we can work together, and you can help reform the system while I help heal bodies, and we can build bridges." She realized he was right, and she could be both things, and an officer who understood smugglers, and a smuggler who respected law, and someone who lived in the space between rigid rules and total freedom. 6 months later, she stood in a new uniform with a new badge that represented the reformed Galactic Peace Force, and their mission was justice. Not just law and protection, not just enforcement. Miller stood beside her at the ceremony and wore a medal for his service to galactic health, and his criminal record had been cleared, and he was officially recognized as the hero he always was. Ember perched on her shoulder and wore a tiny matching badge, and had been officially registered as a peace officer auxiliary dragon, and the first of her kind to serve in law enforcement. The galaxy was still healing, and trust was slowly rebuilding, and there were still corrupt officials hiding and planets struggling with change. But progress was happening, and hope was growing. That night they sat in their ship and looked at the stars and talked about the future, and all the work still to do, and the lives still to save, and the justice still to find. "You know, we never did solve the original case," Solara said, and smiled at the memory, "and I was supposed to arrest you and deliver you for trial. And technically, that case is still open." Miller laughed and pulled her close and said, "Then I guess you will have to keep chasing me, and maybe one day you will catch me and figure out what to do with me." She kissed him and said, "I already caught you, and I already know what to do with you, and we are partners now in everything, and that is all the justice." "I need," Ember made a happy sound, and breathed a perfect ring of quantum fire that hung in the air like a blessing, and the three of them sat together and watched the stars and planned their next mission. The galaxy was vast and full of injustice and suffering and corruption, but it was also full of people willing to fight for what was right and sacrifice for others, and choose hope over fear. And somewhere, among those stars, other police officers were learning the same lesson Solara had learned, and that sometimes the greatest act of law enforcement was knowing when the law itself was wrong. The war between order and freedom would continue, and the balance between law and justice would always be delicate. But people like Solara and Miller would keep fighting and healing and building bridges, because in the end, the real crime had never been smuggling medicine or breaking laws, or even planning violence, and the real crime had been forgetting that justice meant protecting the vulnerable. And the real heroes were those who remembered and acted and chose compassion over rules and lives over laws, and did what was right even when it cost everything. The stars shined on and the galaxy turned, and somewhere a child received medicine that would save their life, and somewhere else a corrupt official faced trial, and justice rolled forward. And in a small ship drifting through space, a elf woman and human, man and tiny dragon, planned their next adventure, and knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Because that was what partners did, and that was what justice meant, and that was how the galaxy would heal, and become better, and find its way to true peace.